Thanks for tuning into the Dinosaurs Lately podcast, the dinosaur podcast that features periodic updates recapping the latest news on the dinosaurs. My name's Ryan Rogers, and this is the podcast that targets a type of dinosaur and tries to catch you up on everything that's been published on them lately. Welcome to the 9th of these interstitial episodes I've created to keep up with all the dinosaur news, even when I'm not publishing new episodes of the Juras-Sick Park-Cast, and I hope it helps you feel more up to date. Welcome to episode 9, Avialans. This is part 1, recorded March 14th, 2026. A continued thank you to Christoph Oakes of Snail, S-N-A-L-E. Check out his incredible albums on Spotify and Bandcamp. Snail's third album is out now. You can find it too on Spotify. It's called Toy and Bee, and I've been playing it a lot because it's really good, and there's a lot of new songs on there to check out. Today's intro is Black Licorice from the album Charlemagne, and our outro is Super Groovy from Snail's self-titled debut album, Snail. 3 things before we get into the thick of things. First, I put together a little PDF on Ankylosaurs. If you'd like a copy, just send me an email and I'll forward it over to you, no charge. It literally costs you nothing to drop me a line and ask for it. RyanSRogers@gmail.com. Second, if you'd like to request a particular family of dinosaurs to cover for an upcoming episode, please do. I've got an informal schedule that I'm keeping, but I can take requests. Third, the last few episodes have been really long, so I'm continuing to divide these up into pieces to make them more bite-sized. If you like this, let me know. Just a quick email that says something like, yeah, breaking it up is way better, something like that. Or else you get massive episodes. I don't know if people like that. I look forward to hearing from you. In today's episode, which nobody has asked for, we're catching up on the Avialans. So getting started to begin with, I'm not sure I'm using the correct term with Avialans, but the category I'm focusing on here is like early birds. The evolutionary moment appears to be when the ancestors of dromaeosaurs like Deinonychus split with the ancestors to Anchiornis, probably in the early Jurassic, though the fossil record hasn't yielded any supporting evidence to that yet. This only further mystifies the early Jurassic when, you'll recall, the dinosaurs seized the world after the end Triassic extinction, and most of life on Earth was decimated by a terrible sequence of millennia, and when it ended, the survivors repopulated the world. Turns out those survivors were dinosaurs, and they expanded and evolved, but how they did it, nobody knows, because the fossil record during the early Jurassic is really sparse. So recall, in the early Jurassic, this is like 175 to 200 million years ago. But in the 25 million year dark ages of evolution, basic basal animals from the Triassic found the blueprints and energy to evolve into the large charismatic megafauna we picture dinosaurs as being. The huge brachiosaurs and apatosaurs, the big allosaurs and megalosaurs, and the strange stegosaurs, as well as some fairly basic looking ornithopods. And of course, all these animals would be overshadowed by the truly famous animals of the Cretaceous, like the titanosaurs, tyrannosaurs, ceratopsians, ankylosaurs, and hadrosaurs, but it all got kicked into gear somewhere in the early Jurassic. It was this moment of incredible diversification and expansion, and dinosaurs did incredible things with their evolutionary opportunities. Among them is the story of the origin of birds. Somewhere in this area, the evolutionary foundations of dromaeosaurs over raptorosaurs and the first birds were cooked up. If only there was some sort of fossil record of it, right? One of the first steps along the path is Anchiornis, a late Jurassic Paravian dinosaur from the Oxfordian age about 150 million years ago. Anchiornis was very much like an early dromaeosaur, a lineage which also had very sparse Jurassic origins, where distinctly dromaeosaur-like teeth have been recovered from the Bathonian age, about 167 million years ago in the Middle Jurassic, but that's speculative. Dromaeosaurs are known from the Cretaceous, and there's only sparse record of them in any meaningful continuity until the Late Cretaceous, when they are really very well represented in the fossil record. What this goes to say is there was an evolutionary split at some point before what the fossil record shows paleontologists, where it's speculated and probable that the earliest origins of birds began. And those birds were based off of basal and ancestral dromaeosaurid body plan. Now, I try to usually go back as far in time as I can and tell a semi-evolutionary story as I read from the latest news articles that have been published on a dinosaur family. But one of the publications in this episode is a chapter from a new book, New Perspectives in Ornithology, 21st Century Dispatches Across the World of Birds. In this book, Dr. Jingmai O'Connor, a terrific guest to the show in episode 56, The Lodge, has published a chapter 8 called The Origin and Early Evolution of Birds. When beginning at the beginning of birds, her summative observation is, quote, "What has become clear is that nearly all features we think of today as avian were either inherited from non-avian dinosaurs or absent in the earliest birds." Some of these non-avian dinosaur features that we, quote, think of today as avian include having a wishbone, feathers, and laying eggs in nests. Dinosaurs did all those things first. Birds just kept doing it. So our first article today is Feather Evolution Following Flight Loss in Crown Group Birds, Relaxed Selection and Development Constraints, published in the journal Evolution in May 2025. Quote, with 11,000 to 18,000 species, a global distribution across many habitats and ecological niches, and an evolutionary history stretching over 150 million years, birds are among the most successful vertebrates. Although many adaptations help explain their evolutionary success, a key adaptation is feathering. This paper was interested in seeing what happens to feathers after a bird has become flightless, or, in other words, in what ways do feathers evolve after an ancestor quits using them to fly. The authors observed that flight loss among birds, quote, strongly correlates with increased body mass and decreased wing length relative to body mass. Without selection for flight, the upper limit on body mass rises, compounded by supportive buoyancy of water on semi-aquatic flightless taxa. The birds get bigger, but their wings don't, and they hypothesize there was a relaxed selection for flight feathers because these flightless birds were opting for running and swimming, for example. The most prominent change in the feathers themselves is that asymmetry decreases, quote, even in species that have been flightless for less than 1 million years. Asymmetric feathers, called remiges when plural, just remex when singular, are essential for achieving lift during flight. Quote, relaxing selection for aerial flight allows for other functions to become more prominent. In some semi-aquatic taxa, flight is shifted underwater to produce novel feather morphologies with unique functions rather than the diversity seen in ratite feathers. Penguins evolve robust, scale-like feathers with wide filaments, small overall size, and high unscaled filament density. Their hydrofoil for lift and thrust during swimming is relatively fleshier than feathered, and their feathers have ice-shedding capability. Penguins are super cool. This study was dominantly on birds, but has some comments on non-avian dinosaurs, which is why I tuned in. Now, a present theory or hypothesis is the types of feathers observed in Maniraptorans, like the dromaeosaurs, suggest they may be secondarily flightless, as they resemble the types of feathers that are observed in the flightless birds, just like the features described in this paper. This paper posits, quote, did some fully terrestrial non-avian dinosaurs have aerially locomoting ancestors such that similar evolutionary tendencies toward repeated flight loss seen in crown group birds yielded multiple independent losses of gliding flight in stem avians? Upon reviewing the condition of Microraptorines, which were like dromaeosaurs with feathers on their arms, legs, and tail, some are interpreted as being flyers, as well as gliders, but they have some members of the family that are too big for flight. Quote, Microraptorines over around 50 kilograms, for example, like Tianyu raptor and Zhanwanlong, were short-armed and possibly incapable of aerial locomotion, despite retaining long, asymmetric primaries consistent with a gliding and flying ancestor. The secondarily flightless interpretation of these larger Microraptorines would require them to exhibit a, quote, reversal in remex vein symmetry, compared to what the authors have reported in their findings on extant feathers, and the, quote, evolutionary rate is lower than those for increased mass or decreased relative wing length than extant birds. In other words, the observations these authors have made on how birds and feathers change after becoming flightless is inconsistent with the non-avian dinosaur observations on how their feathers and bodies changed after hypothetically becoming flightless. The authors do agree that having dromaeosaurs and Anchiornis sharing an ancestor which already evolved asymmetric primaries would mean that the evolution of this feature must be pushed back to the early Jurassic, which is a difficult hypothesis to support because in the early Jurassic, quote, fossil evidence of Paraves is currently lacking and only disputed evidence for broader clades exists. So that said, they don't appear to be entirely dismissive, as they offer freely, quote, wings of Anchiornithines and other non-avian theropods likely function differently as airfoils compared to crown birds. In this, both things can be true. A, their observations on feathers and flightless birds are inconsistent with the theory of flightless non-avian dinosaurs in the Mesozoic, and B, they needn't necessarily be consistent because non-avian flight feathers were likely different than modern birds anyhow. I think at best, we are seeing a hypothetical explanation for what the fossil record shows and a more conservative perspective on what extant birds show. These two perspectives can both be true, based in science, and not agree yet. So we'll move into the Middle Jurassic. We've considered what the ancestral bird of the early Jurassic might be like, and our next article dates itself back to the Middle Jurassic or the Bethonian, about 167 million years ago, when those speculative dromaeosaurid teeth are known from. Recall Jingmai O'Connor tells us, quote, nearly all features we think of today as avian were either inherited from non-avian dinosaurs or absent in the earliest birds. This next article is about an avian feature that has finally had its roots traced back to the non-avian dinosaurs. The article Evolution of the Jaw Joint and Middle Ear Morphologies in the Lineage Towards Birds was published in the journal Zoological Science in January 2026, and it argues that, quote, the deep ear canal of birds can be traced back to the common ancestor of Coelurosaurian dinosaurs. The authors were looking closely at the retroarticular process of the lower jaw, which is just in front of the ear canal, which protects the ear during jaw movements and is a crucial component in the apparatus related to opening the jaws. Quote, in tetrapod evolution, the middle ear evolved independently at least 4 times and represents key innovations for airborne hearing, says the paper. How the jaw bones evolved for airborne hearing is examined through, quote, embryonic developments of chicken, American alligator, and Chinese soft-shelled turtle, as well as the fossil record. And they compared their results with, quote, the fossil data of Mesozoic theropods. According to the author's observations, how the avian ear develops in embryo is a pattern they recognize from the fossil record. Quote, it is possible that deep ear canals seen in the extant birds can be traced back to the common ancestor of the Coelurosaurs. This paper had a lot of vocabulary and science that was well outside my comfort zone, so this is just a very general summary, but it does corroborate Dr. O'Connor's observations that many avian traits are in fact non-avian dinosaur traits, and it's fascinating that the trait in particular is correlated with airborne hearing. Why would Coelurosaurs have adaptations correlated with airborne hearing? That's if I'm understanding this all correctly, and that's a big if, but it's suggesting that they're secondarily flightless. Late Jurassic, so Flash! Those first 3 articles were sort of theoretically talking about speculative avialans that should exist somewhere in the early Jurassic, but now we're entering the Late Jurassic, where real dinosaurs with body fossils are going to give us real stuff to latch onto. The next 2 articles are about the important early first step on the avian lineage, and it's, you'll recall, Anchiornis. This dinosaur was described in 2009 on fossils uncovered from the Xiagou Formation in China, and its holotype is an articulated skeleton with feather impressions lacking the skull, some tail, and the right arm. The holotype is represented by specimen number IVPPV14378, housed at the Institute for Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology. His name is Anchi, which is Greek for near, and Ornis, which is Greek for bird, and huxleyi, which honors Thomas Henry Huxley, who was the historic anatomist and anthropologist and an early evolutionist along with Charles Darwin. It was one of the first ever to suggest that, based on fossils and footprints, that, hey, maybe birds evolved from dinosaurs. And who better to name this formative early bird after than someone just like that? So this next article is called The Cranial Anatomy of Anchiornis huxleyi Sheds New Light on Bird Skull Evolution, published in the journal Vertebrata Paleoasiatica in January 2025. Though the holotype is headless, there are other Anchiornis specimens, and in this paper, the researchers looked at STM-0-47, which is housed at the Shandong Tianyu Museum of Nature, and it's another slab where the entire skeleton has been pressed and imprinted into a rock. Anchiornis from this slab shows that it had pretty long legs, almost like a spider monkey, in fact. It kind of looks like a spider monkey with wings for hands and a lizard head. The skull has little teeth along the jaw and around the tip of the snout, no beak, a long snout, and big eyes, and lots of orbits, which might be a way to keep the skull lightweight, which is great if you're trying to fly. As the authors begin to describe this skull, they start, quote, as in Deinonychosaurs, but unlike stemward Avialans such as Archaeopteryx, the anterior process of the maxilla is substantially shorter than its posterior counterpart. Right away, the comparison with dromaeosaurs is reinforced, showing the close phylogenetic relationship between this early bird species and the Deinonychosaurs, and how it has yet to evolve significantly away from the dromaeosaur shape. They continue, quote, Anchiornis is the oldest known record of the Paraves, around 160 million years ago, the most inclusive clade that contains all living birds, but not Caudipteryx or Epidipteryx. With hundreds of known specimens, Anchiornis constitutes an ideal taxon for investigating morphological modifications across the theropod bird transition. But its cranial morphology remains enigmatic. Until now. That is why they're describing the skull as best as they can. Quote, here we present in-depth description of the cranial morphology of Anchiornis based on 3-dimensional reconstruction of well-preserved specimens. Our study shows that Anchiornis retains the plesiomorphic dinosaurian condition in having a diapsid akinetic skull, where diapsid and akinetic are qualities of dinosaur skulls. In other words, it's a diagnostically dinosaur-like skull, or, in other words, unsurprising. They continue, quote, the mixture of cranial characters shared with dromaeosaurids, troodontids, and stemward Avialan present in Anchiornis demonstrates the complex history of early Avialan cranial evolution. With this new data, they admit there are two interpretations of Anchiornis' phylogenetic position as that basal bird, which the authors call, quote, competing phylogenetic hypotheses that identify Anchiornis as Avialan or troodontid. On one hand, this controversy is ascribed to the sparse fossil record, which is further complicated by preservation that hinders direct observation. They add, quote, on the other hand, evolutionary mosaicism always impacts morphology-based phylogenetic inference. Previous studies show that the early evolution of Avialans has been deeply shaped by mosaicism, attesting to Anchiornis' skull, which exhibits mixed morphology shared with dromaeosaurids, troodontids, and Avialans. So here, mosaicism suggests that lots of animals have similar shapes, and only comparing species by shape is limited by its usefulness. So here, mosaicism suggests lots of animals have similar shapes, and this becomes a limitation when you're comparing animals only by what shape they are. So consider, you could genetically compare extant species, for example, but you can't with dinosaur fossils. Even with new scans and updated descriptions of the Anchiornis skull, adding its updated characteristics into the phylogenetic analysis machine is somewhat fraught with complications because, quote, over 70% of the cranial characters in the data matrix cannot be determined from most other early diverging paravians, which prevents comparison and offsets much phylogenetic significance introduced by revised cranial anatomy. Yes, this skull is scanned nicely, but most other animals you're comparing it against are crushed and busted. So again, it's hard to make comparisons, even if this example is really good. So you can see how challenging working in this realm of the deep past can be, and how limited conclusions are when the data is compromised. The next Anchiornis article is Wing Morphology of Anchiornis huxleyi and the Evolution of Molt Strategies in Paravian Dinosaurs, published in the journal Communications Biology in November 2025. In it, the authors say that much research has been interested in the skeletal transformations associated with the emergence of flight ability from dinosaurs to birds. We're finding a common theme when researchers investigate these earliest birds looking for answers. Quote, newly emerging information concerning the wing structure of Penaraptorans highlights unexpected complexity in the evolution of wing-like structures in non-volant theropods that complicate efforts to understand the origins of flight. The authors say Anchiornis embodies this complexity in complication. Quote, no taxon exemplifies this better than Anchiornis, controversial with regards to its flight abilities and phylogenetic position, alternatively regarded as volant or non-volant, and as an Avialan or as a troodontid. The authors provide in this paper new information concerning Anchiornis' wing structure, including temporary changes due to molt based on 9 specimens. Quote, Anchiornis preserves the first evidence of an irregular molt in a non-avian Penaraptoran, which, together with the unique wing structure, indicates flightlessness. But not just flightless. Quote, the large number of primaries may indicate that this taxon is secondarily flightless, similar to the condition in some crown birds, like ostriches and penguins, although the limited fossil record of feathered Penaraptorans constrains the confidence with which the currently available data can be interpreted. It's become an early bird axiom. Dare you speculate when your data ain't great? But that said, there were some cool observations made. Quote, an examination of color-imparting melanosomes showed that the body feathers of Anchiornis were gray and dark. The face had rufous or reddish-brown speckles. The crown was rufous, and the long limb feathers were white with distal black spangles. What are spangles? I guess this is when the edge of a feather is a dark color while the center of the feather is light colored, reversing the normal pigmentation of the bird. The examples I looked up were mostly light colored borders with dark colored centers, though. It's sort of like being spotted on your feathers, I guess. Plus, the authors observed evidence of molting. Quote, consistent with hypotheses suggesting that Anchiornis was non-volant, we predict that this taxon would exhibit an irregular molt characterized by non-sequential and unpredictable replacement of the remiges, where remiges are asymmetrical flight feathers. Ramix is the singular of remiges. Quote, in such a case, immature feathers could appear anywhere on the wing rather than following an orderly sequence. This molt pattern, although present in flightless species of modern birds, has not been previously documented in non-avian dinosaurs and contrasts with the gradual and sequential ramix molt observed in the volant Microraptor. Ultimately, these authors say that observations regarding what they learned about Anchiornis molt strategies, quote, do not support interpretations that this taxon was capable of flight. All right, beyond Anchiornis, leaving the Oxfordian age of the Jurassic, spending more than 5 million years into the future, we arrive in a Tithonian. which was between 152 and 145 million years ago in the late Jurassic. This is the age of the famous Archaeopteryx, but also now a new Avialan that was described in a paper called Earliest Short-Tailed Bird from the Late Jurassic of China, published in the journal Nature in February 2025. This article again reaffirms the close affinities between early birds and Deinonychosaurians. Again, the early birds were very non-avian dinosaur-like. Quote, although they have feathered wings, the known Jurassic birds are more similar to non-Avialan theropods in having the ancestral long reptilian tail. Quote, this is in stark contrast to most Cretaceous and crownward taxa, which have a short tail that terminates in a compound bone called the pygostyle. It would be expected to find a transitional fossil between the lizard-like Archaeopteryx and the pygostyled Cretaceous birds somewhere in between the late Jurassic and Cretaceous, but instead, these authors are describing Bammenornis, which features a pygostyle even though it's a contemporary of Archaeopteryx. Quote, here we report on the oldest short-tailed Avialan, Bammenornis zhengensis, from the recently discovered late Jurassic Zhengyi fauna, which fills a noticeable spatiotemporal gap in the earliest branching Avialan fossil record. This new animal, quote, exhibits a unique combination of derived ornithothoracian-like pectoral and pelvic girdles and plesiomorphic non-Avialan Maniraptor in hand, demonstrating mosaic evolution along stem Avialan line. So once again, this concept of mosaicism appears, where instead of finding a linear series of transitional forms, instead a strange combination or a mosaic of features like teeth, tails, claws, hands, but also feathers and robust wishbones and pygostyles are observed in different combinations among different animals. That pure transitional fossil may not be out there, and the evolution of early birds is revealing itself to be convoluted. This pygostyle feature rewrites assumptions about the origins of birds, as Bammenornis is now, quote, the sole Jurassic and the oldest short-tailed Avialan yet discovered, pushing back the appearance of this derived bird feature by nearly 20 million years. Bammenornis derives its name from the Mandarin Bammen, which means the Fujian province, and Ornis, which is Greek for bird, and also Zhengyi County, making this the Fujian bird from Zhengyi County. The holotype IVPPV33259, housed at the Institute for Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology, was uncovered from the Nanwan Formation. It's comprised of an incomplete and partially articulated skeleton including carpals, caudal vertebrae, dorsal ribs, dorsal vertebrae, the furcula, ischium, coracoids, femur, fibular, humerus, ilium, scapula, tibia, metacarpals, phalanx, pubis, pygostyle, radius, scapula, tibia, and carpal. So a lot of bones there. But the special important element is the pygostyle, where 5 vertebrae have been fused. In Cretaceous Avialans, that becomes 10 vertebrae. Quote, during the early evolution of birds, a short tail ending in a pygostyle arguably represents a hallmark of evolutionary innovation, which influences many aspects of biology, including distribution of body mass and aerodynamic properties, say the authors. Evolutionarily, quote, the discovery of Bammenornis pushes back the first appearance of short-tailed birds by approximately 20 million years to the base of the Avialan phylogeny, further blurring our understanding about the tempo and mode of bird tail evolution. This is mostly blurred because an early pygostyle having Avialan Jehol Ornis has a long tail, and it has the authors posting questions like, did the pygostyle evolve independently in Bammenornis? Was a long tail re-evolved in Jehol Ornis since the appearance of pygostyle in the last common ancestor of Bammenornis onward? If so, should we redefine the pygostalia as the most inclusive clade that contains all crown birds but not Archaeopteryx? In this case, Jehol Ornis is considered as a deviant pygostalian. Their shrugged interpretation is that, quote, the observed chaos of bird tail evolution, although exaggerated by incomplete fossil records, may have been genuine. A pygostyle evolved independently in some oviraptorosaurs, therizinosaurs, and scansoriopterigids. Maybe Bammenornis represents the first of a long line of pygostyles, or maybe this is another example of all kinds of theropods developing pygostyles in some apparently destined convergent evolution. Lots of questions, which makes Avialans an exciting area for paleontologists to be working in. Quote, these new fossils indicate that Avialans were already fairly diverse by the late Jurassic, with Archaeopteryx and its kin from the Solnhofen limestones in Germany and the Anchiornithids from the Jehol Biota in northeast China. It would be intriguing to explore why no short-tailed Avialans have been found from these two localities. Apart from the abundant aquatic and semi-aquatic vertebrates, the newly recognized Zhengyi fauna holds much promise to fill a critical gap in the evolutionary history of terrestrial ecosystems close to the end of the Jurassic period. And as was referenced in the earlier article, the other late Jurassic early bird that's being published on is the OG Archaeopteryx. We have a paper in Archaeopteryx called Avian Features of Archaeopteryx Feeding Apparatus Reflect Elevated Demands of Flight, published in the journal The Innovation in February 2026. This paper is again led by Dr. O'Connor, where she begins by admitting powered flight costs a lot of energy, and it is therefore reasonable that animals that use powered flight must have a novel apparatus for refueling. The paper says, quote, the appearance of dinosaurian flight should therefore be associated with novel features related to increased feeding or digestive efficiency. Neo-ornithines have several unique rostral features that facilitate complex oral tasks, increasing feeding efficiency. These include a mechanoreceptive bill tip organ, highly mobile tongue, and oral papillae. A lot of complex ideas in that sentence. First, neo-ornithine means aves, or extant birds. These are dominantly known for having a toothless beak and mostly don't have clawed hands. You know, birds. The ones that you see outside. These are neo-ornithines. The mechanoreceptive bill tip organ is a specialized sensory structure at the tip of a beak that detects vibrations, pressures, and tactile information. They can sense and locate, for example, concealed prey underwater or in mud. And oral papillae appear to be pointy structures in the rear of the beak, above the throat, and in the mouth. Hopefully the paper explains what these are in greater detail. We'll see. Now, this paper was studying a fairly newly acquired specimen at the Field Museum in Chicago, accessioned as FMNHPA830, which is described as an uncrushed complete skeleton in two slabs representing the 14th specimen of Archaeopteryx. This specimen was described by a team led by Dr. O'Connor in the paper Chicago Archaeopteryx Informs on the Early Evolution of the Avian Bauplan, published in the journal Nature in May 2025. Sneak, a news story inside a news story. The Chicago Archaeopteryx has, quote, exceptional preservation, and the microcomputed tomographic data make it, quote, one of the best exemplars of this iconic taxon, preserving important data regarding skeletal transformation and plumage evolution in relation to the acquisition of flight during early avian evolution. The skull, quote, reveals a palatal morphology intermediate between troodontids and crownward Cretaceous birds, and modifications of the skull reflect the shift towards a less rigid cranial architecture in Archaeopterygids from non-avian theropods. This thing has a complete vertebral column, the longest tail, skin traces on the hands, foot pads that indicate they were meant for walking, not raptorial grasping, and then so much information on the feathers. It's a cool paper, and it's a super cool specimen. All right, that's the Chicago specimen. Now back to how it's informing the origins of flight. The earlier Archaeopteryx paper describes the, quote, first evidence of the presence of these features in Archaeopteryx, the oldest known avian dinosaur. Large neurovascular openings at the tip of both the upper and lower jaw indicate the neurovasculature contained within the sensitive rostrum of non-avian theropods exited the tip of the snout. This suggests the presence of a mechanoreceptive soft tissue structure that was apparently widespread in early diverging toothed birds, adding to the recognized structural diversity of the avian bill tip organ. The authors also found corroborating evidence of increased tongue mobility that's consistent with the interdependence of these structures in extant birds. What's to be thought of finding these three traits that are so common to neo-ornithines in the earliest birds? The authors say, quote, the appearance of these three features, close to the origin of feather-driven flight, suggests they evolved through pressures imposed by the increased caloric demands associated with the transition from terrestrial predator to volant bird. They conclude, quote, new data from the Chicago Archaeopteryx reveal the previously undocumented presence of basohyal and demonstrate the oral papillae most likely arose early in avian evolution, whereas widespread in non-neornithine birds, as those features are in extant neornithines. The presence of both these features supports hypotheses that they function interdependently and further suggests that they co-evolved. Further, quote, neurovascular openings at the tip of the upper and lower jaw suggest that some kind of bill tip organ, a BTO, may also be a synapomorphy of birds, recording the transition from the sensitive rostrum in non-avian theropods to the BTO in birds. They're taking care of business. In summation, quote, this new information suggests that the sensitive and highly efficient avian rostrum evolved early in avian evolution and may reflect a shift in feeding behavior close to the origin of aves, possibly reflecting the advent of flight and the higher caloric burden imposed by this demanding form of locomotion. The next article, new fossils imply a deeper origin of modern birds in the Mesozoic, published in the journal National Science Review in July 2025, are also saying we should be looking deeper into the past to find the origins of birds. These authors specifically look at a few recent papers, including a new specimen of Vagavis, an Antarctic goose from the latest Cretaceous, which provides a, quote, much better understanding of the species' morphology, which align pretty much to being like a duck, even though this is still in the days of dinosaurs. We might get to another article later that tells us that it was more like a loon than a duck, but we'll see. Then they refer to the Bambinornis article that we talked about, which, as we just discussed, and that these, quote, new late Jurassic fossils considerably extend the horizon of avian diversification backwards in time, which we've also discussed earlier. They also refer to a U-shaped furcula, or wishbone, that was previously best known from the early Cretaceous, but now has its origins dated into the late Jurassic too. With the Vegavus fossils from Antarctica and the Bambinornis from eastern China, this article says, quote, the geographic dimension of these new discoveries is critical. Bambinornis' pygostyle, along with the U-shaped furcula being in China, yet contemporaneous with the European Archaeopteryx, quote, points to a worldwide distribution of stem group birds in the late Jurassic, challenging the argument that their emergence was in its earliest stages at that time. The authors add, quote, similarly, this conformation of two crown group aves from the late Cretaceous in both the northern and southern hemispheres underscores the widespread distribution of modern birds during that period. Collectively, these fossil discoveries suggest a deeper origin of birds and their crown groups than previously hypothesized. This paper also says that an advanced genomic analysis on avian distribution has, quote, concluded that there was an explosive radiation of neo-aves, which make up around 95% of all modern birds, beginning at about the time of the KPG boundary. These studies encourage the interpretation that the, quote, initial crown group diversification occurred before the KPG boundary. This extends the hypothesis that modern bird order related to neo-aves, quote, originated during an evolutionary frenzy following the KPG catastrophe. After, quote, many of the ecological niches suddenly left vacant by the KPG event were subsequently reoccupied by the diversifying neo-aves as intuitively compelling explanation for Earth's modern avian diversity. But not all studies arrive at the same conclusion, because mammals, flowering plants, fishes, and pollinating insects had their radiation of diversification occur, quote, long before the KPG boundary. And in fact, a, quote, recent phylogenetic study casts doubt on the neo-avian post-KPG explosion hypothesis, which would place the emergence of, quote, around 24 neo-avian orders within the late Cretaceous, largely between around 66 and 85 million years ago. The authors conclude, quote, we still have no resolution on when the major radiation of birds occurred, but they're saying it wasn't necessarily after the extinction event. This next article is atypical from all the rest. It's not on a discovery based in China, and it is about an early bird far outside the temporal parameters of most of the latest discoveries. Published in Swiss Journal of Paleontology in February 2026 is the article, an isolated skull from the Las Hoyas informs the early evolution towards elongated rostra in enantiornithine birds. This specimen is from the Barremian age, around 129 to 126 million years ago, excavated on the Iberian Peninsula in Spain, in what was a freshwater inland and seasonal wetland in the subtropics. The new bird is named Gorgonavis alcyone. You may recall that the horrible monsters that turn people to stone just by staring at them, the Gorgona, the most famous of which is Medusa. And that's where we get this name from. The Gorgona are the ancient Greek protective deities who turn people to stone with their stare, like Medusa. And Avis is Latin for bird. And Alcyone refers to one of the 7 Pleiades in ancient Greek mythology who were transfigured into a kingfisher, a group of crown birds sharing some similarities with the enantiornithines that show elongated rostra, such as Longipterigids. So its name means the kingfisher-like bird turned to stone. Gorgonavis alcyone. Rostra, you'll recall, is the length of the snout. Imagine the beak of a kingfisher versus a canary, for example. It's much longer. Longipterigids are a family of enantiornithines that are characterized by their extremely long, toothed snouts, known to be 60% length of the skull. So that's a lot of snout compared to the whole skull. The holotype MUPA-LH13240, housed at the Museo de Paleontología de Castilla-La Mancha, was uncovered from the La Hoyas Formation. It's comprised of a fragmentary but partially articulated skull, mostly preserving rostral and mandibular elements exposed in the surface of a single limestone slab. The fusion of the bones suggests that the individual is nearing skeletal maturity, say the authors, but its status as a Longipterigid is sort of dubious. Two things make comparing this new species with other known enantiornithines difficult, and that is Gorgonavis' lack of postcranial remains. Without the rest of its skeleton, it's hard to compare it to other known birds. Second, other known birds are overwhelmingly missing their skulls. So without all the other skulls, it's hard to compare this skull to other birds too. Phylogenetically, though, what's observable about Gorgonavis makes these authors believe it was a Longipterygid. The bodies of other birds endemic to the Iberian Peninsula do not, quote, share any synapomorphies defining Longipterygidae, so this birdie is distinct among other known enantiornithines in this time and place. Quote, the discovery of Gorgonavis adds diversity to the known cranial morphology of the stem avian lineage, representing the first occurrence of an enantiornithine showing a tendency to elongate the facial skeleton outside the Jehol Biota of northeastern China. They add, quote, the occurrence of a new early bird with an elongated rostrum at Las Hoyas, potentially related to the Longipterygids, informs the presence of a specialized craniofacial condition in a well-known subtropical paleoecosystem. It also suggests a Eurasian distribution for this well-established early Cretaceous enantiornithine lineage. Beyond its biogeographic implications, if our phylogenetic interpretation of Gorgonavis as a Longipterygid is correct, this new fossil can clarify intraclade character evolution, so they say. Flashing millions of years into the future from the articles we've been discussing, which have laid the foundations of our present understanding of the origins of birds, we're now reading discoveries from the Aptian age of the early Cretaceous between 126 and 113 million years ago. In this 13 million year span, we have 7 articles about Chinese birds, beginning with, in no particular order, Paraves attenboroughi, described in the paper first Edentulus enantiornithine from the Lower Cretaceous Jehol Avifauna, published in the journal Cretaceous Research in July 2024. Paraves derives its name from the Latin impar, which means odd, and avis, which means bird, and Attenboroughi honors Sir David Attenborough, whom you all know as the presenter in endless British nature documentaries, making this Sir David Attenborough's odd bird. What makes Paraves odd? It represents, quote, the first Edentulus enantiornithine from the Lower Cretaceous. The discovery of this taxon contributes to the multiple independent evolutionary occurrences of complete tooth loss among Mesozoic birds. The loss of teeth in enantiornithines may be linked to shifts in feeding behavior. However, as yet there is no evidence that this shift was driven by herbivory, as is suggested for ornithuromorphs and non-avian dinosaurs. The authors say that its snout suggests it may have had a, quote, generalist diet similar to extant starlings and flycatchers. This is odd because, to this point, the Deinonychosaurian traits of jaws, teeth, and reptilian-like tail were still traits that birds hadn't yet evolved away from. The forelimbs were also, quote, odd, as they reveal, quote, multiple points of comparatively hypertrophied muscled attachments, morphologies similar to extant birds that are capable of quick and powerful takeoffs, a useful strategy employed in some terrestrial birds to escape predation. Hypertrophied, of course, is the opposite of atrophied. These muscles were much more robust than its ancestors, which you'd expect if this animal were flying with them. And its feet appeared to have been a transitional form that was suitable for walking on or for perching. Quote, together, the morphology of the rostrum, forelimbs, and hind legs suggests that Paraves may have occupied a generalist foraging ecology, spending considerable time on the ground and utilizing arboreal settings to either roost or flee from predation. Its holotype STM11-176, housed at the Shandong Tianyu Museum of Nature, was uncovered from the Jiufotang Formation. It's comprised of an articulated, nearly complete specimen preserved in ventral view, lacking the vertebral column and most of the gastralia, including faint feather impressions on a slab. Also from the Jiufotang Formation, and thus also from the Aptian Age, we have an article on Shangyang, which is another enantiornithine bird described in the paper Iridescent Structural Coloration in Crested Cretaceous Enantiornithine Bird from the Jehol Biota, published in the journal eLife, published in August 2025. Shangyang is a very small animal described in 2019 whose holotype IVPPV25033 is a complete skeleton on a slab. It'd fit in the palm of your hand, I think. Gone is the lizard-like tail, but it still has teeth, a thin and Y-shaped wishbone or furcula, and there are tiny claws in its fingers and a completely fused pygostyle. This paper is based on another specimen, IVP VP26899, which preserves a, quote, diverse feather assemblage across the body with dense contour feathers, flight remiges, and 2 rachis-dominated tail feathers. Recall, remiges are asymmetrical feathers which are necessary for flight. The authors studied this specimen, quote, as a step forward in our reconstruction of the structure and function of early bird feathers. We examined the unique head crest feathers. Giving this animal further character among its diverse feather morphologies, the authors say, quote, this specimen also displays A strikingly enlarged feather crest on the head that uniquely extends from the caudal end of the skull to a position rostral to the nasal bone. It's a cool looking fossil, and with a combination of, quote, sectioning and microscopic techniques along with the application of finite difference time domain modeling, the authors were able to estimate the, quote, range of iridescent colors from the fossilized melanosomes preserved in the elongate head crest feathers. And what do they find? The, quote, densely packed rod-like melanosomes are estimated to have yielded from red to deep blue iridescent coloration of the head feathers, which they had contributed to the feather's structural strength. They believe it's likely a male specimen. The crest suggests both a, quote, signaling function of the iridescent crest and a potential behavioral role in adjusting the angle of light iridescence to control the display of the iridescent structural coloration. They add, quote, this diversity in feather coloration in an early bird fits well with its forested environment, as proposed by the coeval fossil plant community. Tropical forest environments are accompanied by colorful flowering plants and green leaves, and the structural color of this feathered crest is advantageous for bird signaling as well. Forest environments can be advantageous for birds and their signaling, as more colorful feathers are found today in tropical regions, as demonstrated among extant vibrant coloration of passeriform birds in particular. Our next article is about a new enantiornithine from the Jehol Group, also in China, named a new diminutive species of bohyornithid enantiornithine from the Lower Cretaceous Jehol Group, northern China, published in Scientific Reports in December 2024. In this paper, they describe the enantiornithines as the, quote, most successful early diverging avian clade, where fossils reveal, quote, important information regarding the structure of Cretaceous avifaunas and the parallel refinement of flight alongside the ornithuromorph lineage that includes modern birds. The most diverse group of the enantiornithines is the bohyornithidae, of which this new animal is one. These birds are known from the Jehol Biota in northeastern China. This new animal is aptly named Neo-Bohyornis lamedongensis. The authors say, quote, like most enantiornithines, bohyornithids were likely arboreal based on their pedal morphology, in which the pedal phalanges elongate distally within each digit, ending in large recurved unguals. So you can imagine a perching foot, like a bird you'd see up in a tree today. My notes tell me bohyornithids were predatory ancestral birds with large, robust, and conical teeth that had sharp and pointed tips that curved backwards. Their teeth suggest that they ate shellfish or crustaceans, and they also are known to have had long, ribbon-like tail feathers with barbs at the tips and legs like ospreys. The authors of this paper say the claws of Neo-Bohyorniths are, compared to other taxa, quote, proportionately larger and more recurved. Now, as the title says, this guy was diminutive, maybe 8 centimeters long. So if it's, quote, predatory, you know it's not hunting down large prey. That said, it is fossilized with a fish the size of its foot. At its foot, in terms of it being a transitional bird, it still has teeth, which are most robust at the tip of the snout. And the fusion in the bone suggests that the specimen was a mature individual, so this isn't likely a juvenile, which the authors say, quote, therefore substantially increases the known size range of this clade. The holotype, which contains the fish specimen MHGU-0288, housed at the Museum of Hebei GEO University, was uncovered from the Jiufotang Formation. It's comprised of a nearly complete skeleton and articulated skeleton preserved in dorsal aspect with traces of feathers surrounding the skeleton. The feathers are rarely preserved in bohyornithids and reveal asymmetrical flight feathers. Other features that make Neo-Bohyornis unique include smaller manual claws and an increased number of sacral vertebrae, which they say, quote, indicates bohyornithids evolved increased flight capabilities in parallel to other enantiornithine lineages. So Neo-Bohyornis represents a new taxon. It contributes to the recognized diversity of bohyornithids in the Jiufotang Formation, especially regarding its body size, and it highlights skeletal adaptations in the reduction of its manual claws and a greater number of sacral vertebrae, which were likely to evolve a more refined flight capability, paralleling other enantiornithine lineages. Most exciting, it preserves the best-known plumage of any bohyornithid, and it demonstrates that many different species likely had these long, paired tail feathers. The last bird was diminutive. The next is, quote, small-bodied, as published in the paper A New Small-Bodied Longipterygid from the Aptian Jiufotang Formation Preserving Unusual Gastroliths, published in the journal Paleontologica Electronica in December 2025. The Longipterigids are another type of an antiornithine, which you'll recall resemble modern birds, but have teeth and clawed fingers on each wing. Longipterigids are small to medium-sized birds with elongate rostra, or a long snout, that account for approximately 60% of their entire skull's length, and they had distally restricted dentition, which means the teeth near the back, think of where your molars are, don't have much space to function. They're all known from the early Cretaceous of China. They only had teeth in the top of their jaw, and their pagastyles, where the feathers fuse into a tail, were usually large and longer than their foot bones. This new bird, Chromiornis funky, is named to honor Canadian electro-funk duo Dave One and P Thug, who assembled to become the Montreal-based synth-pop duo Chromio. Literally, Chromiornis funky. It gets jealous, but it's too cool to admit it. So his name means literally Chromiornis funkii, and it gets jealous, but it's too cool to admit it. How small is this guy? They estimate 33.5 grams. The holotype STM7-156, housed at the Shandong Tianyu Museum of Nature, was uncovered from the Jiufotang Formation. It's comprised of a nearly complete and articulated mature individual preserved in a slab and counterslab, missing most of the pelvis and left pedal digits, also preserving soft tissues of the body, feathers, and a large mass of gastroliths just adjacent to the cervical vertebrae. The skeletal features help diagnose the bird and finds its place in the cladistic analysis, but there are some fascinating observations from this fossil regarding soft tissues. Some dark traces in the orbit the authors interpret as, quote, remnants of the eye preserved within the bounds of the sclerical ring, which is pretty incredible. There are traces of feathers preserved along the dorsal margin of the skull, continuing along the dorsal margin of the neck and extend along both shoulders and the left humerus and the body. There are, quote, disarticulated clumps of feathers preserving below the right forelimb, and more, quote, long and narrow feathers, which have been interpreted as, quote, indicative of immature feathers that may suggest this bird was in molt at the time of death. Quote, no flight feathers appear to be preserved, the authors say. Under UVA light, they add that along the neck, left hand, right leg, and surrounding the pegastyle, there appears to be fossilized skin. The observation of skin has helped the authors interpret muscle attachments and whether some elements of the animal were robust, powerful, or not. As for the gastroliths, they appear in a large, tight cluster preserved in one of the counterslabs, which are rounded, subspherical, and small. There are some gastroliths that appear around the neck, and the data they collected on these gastroliths suggests that they were not a gastric mill, or they do not interpret them as gizzard stones. Quote, the usual mass of gastroliths preserved within the esophagus represent a conundrum that cannot be resolved with currently available data, but poses interesting questions about behavior and the evolution of the digestive system to be explored in the future. Some reasons birds swallow stones include cleansing the cranial portions of their digestive tract, serving as ballast in penguins during the subaqueous foraging, or for nutritional or medicinal purposes when selecting calcium-rich rocks to aid in eggshell production, or combating parasites, say the authors, but none of these quite resemble what they're looking at in the fossil. Final observation the authors make on gastroliths, quote, we suggest the absence of a gastric mill in enantiornithines reflects their relatively limited flight capabilities. I think I'm reading this correctly when I say enantiornithines are not known to have gastroliths or gizzard stones, and a gastric mill. Birds adopting gastric mills because they reduce their oral processing to reduce weight for the purpose of flight. Having a gastric mill as a bird would mean that you are good at flying, whereas no gastric mill means you may not be a strong flyer. So you wouldn't or couldn't be weighed down with stones in your gizzard. The authors also describe correlations in the pectoral girdle. Smaller absent gastric mills, quote, may reflect a cost-benefit balance between increased digestive capabilities, the energetic cost of foraging for stones, and the decreased flight functionality in stem avian lineages, which lack the full suite of skeletal adaptations for advanced flight capabilities observed in ornithuromorphs. Our next article is about another new enantiornithine named Novavis, described in the paper, a new enantiornithine from the Lower Cretaceous Xiagou Formation with unusually short pubes, published in the journal Geobios in June 2025. The name Neoavis pubesculata is rooted in Latin terms, making this the strange bird with short pubis, and it's also a near homonym for Nova Rose yamardo sumida. So novus is Latin for strange, and avis is Latin for bird, and pubesculata is Latin for short pubis, and the adjectival suffix strange bird with short pubis, and the name is also in honor of Nova Rose Jamardo Sumida. The holotype IVPP V31957, housed at the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology, was uncovered from the Xiagou Formation. It's comprised of a partial skeleton consisting of caudal vertebrae, a right ischium, both pubes, and the nearly complete remains of both hind limbs preserved in a slab. What makes this a distinct new species is the unusually short pubis that is, quote, sub-equal in length of the ischium, which is an, quote, a topomorphy among enantiornithines. So, this unusual feature makes this diagnostically a new species, Novavis pubisculata. Quote, the abbreviated length of the pubis suggests that the abdominal cavity in this species was proportionately shorter than in all other known enantiornithines. The authors considered which muscles would be most affected by these shorter pubes and say, quote, in crowned avians, this would result in a decrease in the contraction speed of these muscles, which play a role in tail fanning and are thus important for flight during takeoff and landing. That said, the fragmentary nature of the specimen means the biomechanical implications of the shortened pubis can't really be known for certain. They add, quote, although the underlying function of the short pubis and changes in the size of the abdominal cavity are unknown, the widespread absence of aerodynamic tail musculature and plumage in enantiornithines may have relaxed pressures constraining the length of these muscles, such that elongation of these muscles through a shortened pubis was not detrimental to the aerodynamic abilities of these birds. This new species, quote, contributes to the ever-growing diversity of the enantiornithines from the Lower Cretaceous deposits in China. Although incomplete, the unusual short pubic morphology significantly increases the known morphological diversity of this clade. As a group, enantiornithines lack aerodynamic tail structures, which possibly made the reduction in pubic tail length possible, say the authors. The phylogenetic analysis machine also relates Novavis as closely related to the Longipterigids, as Chromiornis was, so another similar animal from the different part of China. All right, we're going to take a break here. You want to catch the rest of this episode, we got another half to go. Please tune in for part 2 or part B, one of those things. Thanks for tuning in to Dinosaurs Lately. If you'd like to find links to the materials discussed on today's show, you can visit dinosaurslately.blogspot.com, which is a companion piece to the Dinosaurs Lately podcast. A special thanks to Hector and to Ben Chrysler at the Dinosaur Mailing List for all his contributions that makes wrangling all these news stories possible, and a special commemorative thank you to Dr. Hans-Dieter Sues. May he rest in peace. Remember, I have a new PDF on Ankylosaurs. If you would like a copy, just send me an email and I'll forward it over to you. No charge. Buyer beware. That sort of thing. And if you'd like to request a family of dinosaurs to focus on for an upcoming episode, drop me a line and we can, just request it. It'd be fun. Dinosaurs Lately is a companion show to the Juras-Sick Park-Cast, a podcast where guests chat with me about Michael Crichton's 1990 novel Juras-Sick Park. And also not that too. If you'd like to be a guest on that show, you can reach me at ryansrogers@gmail.com. These podcasts are part of the Spring Chickens banner of amateur intellectual properties, including the Spring Chickens Funny Pages, Tomb of the Undead graphic novel, Second Lapse graphic novelettes, The Infantry, and the worst of them all, the King Street Capers. And you can find links to all that baggage in the show notes or by visiting the schickens.blogspot.com. And you can connect and follow on Facebook at facebook.com/springchickencapers, on YouTube by searching for the Juras-Sick Park-Cast podcast, on Tumblr at Mr. Rogers22, or on X at RogersRyan22, and I'm on Blue Sky at RogersRyan22.bsky.social. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you're feeling all caught up on Avialans for now. Until next time.